Imagine the scene in the year 613. The long bloody feud between the queens is over. Brunhilde's mutilated body has been cleared from the field, and Clothar too, son of the triumphant Fredegund, stands as the sole king of all the Franks. The kingdom is unified, the civil wars are over, and a semblance of peace has descended upon the land. On the surface, it is a restoration of the golden age of his great-grandfather, Clovis. But this victory was built on a foundation of compromise, a victory that contained the seeds of his dynasty's long and irreversible decline. To win the war, Clothar had relied on the treachery of the Austrasian aristocracy, and now the nobles had come to collect their reward. The price of unity was the Edict of Paris, a decree in which the king formally signed away vast portions of royal power, guaranteeing the rights, lands, and autonomy of the very nobles who had made his victory possible. With this act, a slow, quiet, and largely unwritten chapter of Merovingian history begins. It is the age of the Roi Fainéants, a French term that translates roughly as the do-nothing kings. The name conjures an image of lazy, decadent, and inept rulers. And while some of the later kings may well have fit that description, the term is misleading. Their idleness was not necessarily a personal failing. It was an institutional reality. They were kings who were prevented from doing anything, monarchs who reigned but did not rule. They became living symbols, ceremonial figureheads, in a kingdom where the real, tangible power was steadily and relentlessly shifting into the hands of another. To understand this slow fade, you must turn your attention away from the throne and toward a position that began as little more than a household servant, the mayor of the palace, or major domus in Latin. Originally, the mayor was simply the chief steward of the king's household. In a world where the state was seen as the king's private property, this was an important job. He managed the royal villas, oversaw the agricultural production of the royal estates, and controlled the king's treasury. He was the chief administrator of the king's personal wealth. But as the decades of civil war dragged on, the kings were forced to grant more and more of their royal lands to the nobility to ensure their loyalty. With each grant, the king's personal domain shrank, and the remaining lands became ever more critical. The mayor of the palace, as the manager of this dwindling but essential resource, saw his own power grow in inverse proportion. He controlled the flow of money, the patronage, and the access to what remained of the crown's wealth. Then came the Edict of Paris in 614. This decree effectively made the office of the mayor a political prize, one to be controlled by the most powerful aristocratic faction in each of the Frankish sub-kingdoms of Neustria, Austrasia, and Burgundy. The mayor was no longer simply the king's man. He was the nobility's man in the king's house. His job was to manage the kingdom's affairs on behalf of the aristocracy, and to manage the king himself. In the eastern kingdom of Austrasia, the office fell into the hands of the two powerful men who had betrayed Queen Brunhilde Pepin of Landen, who became mayor, and Bishop Arnulf of Metz, who became the king's chief advisor. The families of these two men would eventually intermarry, forging a single, immensely powerful clan known to history as the Pippinids or Arnulfings that would come to dominate the office of mayor for generations. They played a long game, patiently consolidating their power, accumulating vast private estates, and building a network of loyalty that would soon eclipse that of the king himself. So, what was life like for one of these late Merovingian kings? They still possessed the one undeniable symbol of their right to rule, their long, uncut hair. This was the sacred mark of their dynasty, a tradition stretching back to the pagan past. Tuka King's hair was still considered an act of deposition, a symbolic stripping of his power and virility. The mayors, for all their practical power, dared not touch it. The kings were, in a sense, living relics. They were often confined to a few rural royal estates, far from the political centers of power. Their lives were devoid of real political action. They no longer led armies into battle. The mayor of the palace did that. They no longer drafted laws or negotiated with foreign powers. The mayor did that too, The Carolingian historian Einhard, writing later with the clear intention of legitimizing his own dynasty's seizure of power, painted a vivid and humiliating portrait of these kings. He described the Merovingian ruler as a man with no real wealth, possessing only a single, poorly managed estate. When he needed to travel, he did not ride at the head of a glittering procession. Instead, he was transported in a rustic cart drawn by a team of oxen, driven by a simple herdsman. Once a year, he would travel in this manner to the Marchfield, the great annual assembly of the Franks. There, he would be led to his throne, where he would sit in state, a silent, long-haired figure. He would then recite a few prepared remarks, words written for him by his mayor, formally acknowledging the decisions that had already been made without him. After the ceremony, he would get back into his ox cart and return to his seclusion, not to be seen again until the following year. This image, though a piece of political propaganda, captures the essential truth of their condition. Their role had become purely ceremonial. Their job was not to rule, but simply to be the king, to provide the magical, sacred legitimacy of the Merovingian bloodline, while the mayor of the palace wielded all the actual power. The decline was not instantaneous. There was one last brilliant flicker of royal authority before the long twilight descended. King Dagobert I, who ruled a reunified realm from 629 to 639, is widely considered to be the last effective and powerful Merovingian king. For a decade, he managed to reverse the trend. He was energetic, intelligent, and ruthless. He successfully asserted his authority over the provincial nobles and kept his mayors, including Pepin of Landen, in their place. He was active in foreign affairs, campaigning against the Slavs in the east and maintaining diplomatic ties with the Byzantine and Lombard courts. He was a great patron of the church, most famously founding the Abbey of Saint Denis, just outside Paris, which he designated as the future burial place for himself and his dynasty. For a brief period, it seemed as if the power and prestige of the monarchy had been restored. But Dagobert's success was personal, not systemic. It was a result of his own force of will, and even he had to make significant concessions to the aristocracy to maintain peace. His reign was the exception that proved the rule. The moment he died in 639, the system reasserted itself. His kingdom was divided between his two very young sons, Sigebert III in Austrasia, and Clovis II in Neustria. With child kings on the thrones, all the power flowed back to the mayors of the palace. In Austrasia, the Pippinid family regained total control. In Neustria, a rival aristocratic faction did the same. The kings were once again reduced to pawns, their names used as a rubber stamp for the ambitions of their chief ministers. The power struggle for the Frankish realm was no longer between royal brothers, but between the rival mayors of Austrasia and Neustria. The king was now just a symbol, a lock of long hair in an ox cart, a sacred vessel carefully preserved for its legitimizing magic. The mayor of the palace commanded the armies, controlled the treasury, and made the laws. He held all the power, bore all the responsibility, and did all the work of a king. When one man does all the work, and another wears the crown, how long can that arrangement possibly last? What happens when the mayor, who already possesses the reality of power, begins to think that the crown, and the sacred legitimacy that comes with it, should also rightfully be his? After the death of King Dagobert I, in 639, the flickering flame of Merovingian royal authority was all but extinguished. The Frankish world, as it had done so many times before, fractured once again along its customary fault lines. The kingdoms of Neustria in the west and Austrasia in the east, nominally ruled by Dagobert's young sons, became the personal fiefdoms of their respective mayors of the palace. The Merovingian kings still sat on their thrones, their long hair a testament to a legitimacy that was now purely symbolic. But the real story of the 7th century is the story of the mayors. A brutal and protracted power struggle between the aristocratic factions of Neustria and Austrasia for control of the entire Frankish realm. In Austrasia, Power was firmly in the hands of the Pipinid family. Pepin of Landon's son, Grimoald the Elder, inherited the mayorship and his father's vast network of influence. He was an ambitious man who looked at the powerless child king he served, Sigebert III, and saw an opportunity to accelerate history. He grew tired of ruling from the shadows. In the mid-650s, when King Sigebert III died, Grimoald made a daring and premature bid for the throne itself. This episode is a crucial, often overlooked, dress rehearsal for the final Carolingian takeover, nearly a century later. Sigebert III had left behind a legitimate heir, a very young son named Dagobert II. This boy was the rightful Merovingian king of Austrasia. Major Grimoald, in a move of shocking audacity, had the young prince seized. He did not kill him. That would have been too crude, and would have certainly sparked a revolt. Instead, he employed the classic Merovingian tool of political disqualification. He had the boy's sacred long hair shorn, the ritualistic tonsure that stripped him of his royal status. He then had the powerless child exiled, sent far away to a monastery in the remote wilderness of Ireland, where he would surely be forgotten by the world. With the legitimate heir removed from the board, Grimoald took the final, unprecedented step. He declared that his own son was now the rightful king. To give this usurpation a veneer of legitimacy, he gave his son the traditional Merovingian royal name of Chilbert, and he is known to history as Chilbert the Adopted. For the first time, a non-Merovingian sat on the Frankish throne. The Pipinid family had made their play, and it failed. Spectacularly, Grimoald had fatally misjudged the political climate. The Frankish aristocracy, particularly the powerful nobles of the rival kingdom of Neustria, were not yet ready to abandon a dynasty that had ruled for over 2 centuries. The Merovingian bloodline still held a deep, almost magical sway over the minds of the people. A king without the proper lineage was simply unthinkable. It was a violation of the sacred order. The Neustrian nobility united against the usurper. Grimoald was captured, taken to Paris, and imprisoned. There, in the dungeons of his rival kingdom, he was tortured and executed. His son, the short-lived King Childebert, the Adopted, was also deposed and killed. The Pipinid family's first grasp for the crown had ended in disaster. The lesson was brutal and clear. You could wield the power of a king, you could command the armies and control the treasury, but you could not yet wear the crown. The time was not right. The Merovingian name was still the only source of true legitimacy. The Pipinids, chastened and diminished, retreated into the background for a time, licking their wounds and rebuilding their power base in Austrasia. They had learned that the final step could not be rushed. They would have to be more patient, content to rule through the Merovingian kings before they could ever hope to replace them. Decades passed. The Frankish world continued to be dominated by the rivalry between the Neustrian and Austrasian mayors. Then, from the humbled Pipinid clan, a new and formidable figure emerged, Pepin of Herstal, a nephew of the executed Grimoald. Pepin, too, as he is known, was a political genius. He carefully rebuilt his family's fortunes, consolidating their vast estates in Austrasia and re-establishing himself as the undisputed leader of the Austrasian aristocracy. He learned from his uncle's mistakes and showed no outward ambition for the crown itself. Instead, he focused on a different prize, the mayorship of all the Frankish kingdoms. The culmination of this long struggle came in 687, at the Battle of Tertry. This was not a battle between kings. The respective Merovingian kings of Neustria and Austrasia were irrelevant, mere puppets in the game. Tertry was the final showdown between the two great aristocratic powers, the Austrasians, led by Pepin of Herstal, and the Neustrians, led by their mayor, Berker. Pepin's Austrasian forces, drawn from the hardy, land-based warriors of the Eastern Kingdom, proved superior. He crushed the Neustrian army in a single, decisive battle. Following his victory, Pepin marched on the Neustrian court and captured both Mayor Berker and his king, Buderic III. Now, he stood at a crossroads. He had the power to depose the king, to perhaps even try to take the crown as his uncle had done. But Pepin was wiser. He did not make the same mistake. He had no interest in becoming another executed usurper. Instead, he kept King Duderic III on the throne, but he had himself declared the mayor of the palace for Neustria, as well as Austrasia. He then forced Duderic, his captive king, to issue decrees that officially recognized him as the mayor of the entire reunified Frankish realm. This was the new political reality. From 687 onwards, there was once again a single king of the Franks in name, but there was also a single mayor of the palace in fact. Pepin of Herstal was the undisputed ruler of the kingdom. He adopted the title Dux et Princeps, Francorum, Duke, and Prince of the Franks. The title was carefully chosen. It avoided the word King Rex, but clearly proclaimed his status as the supreme military and political leader of the Frankish people. He was the king in all but name. Under Pepin's long and stable rule, the Merovingian kings became completely irrelevant. They were phantoms, kept in seclusion, and brought out only when needed. When one king died, Pepin would simply select another suitable Merovingian cousin or nephew from a monastery, place him on the throne for a few years until he died of natural causes or became inconvenient, and then repeat the process. The kings were now interchangeable placeholders, their reigns short, their impact zero. The royal court had been replaced by the mayor's court. The Frankish state was now the personal domain of the Pepinid family. Pepin of Herstal had succeeded, where his uncle Grimoald had failed. He had found the solution to the problem of power. He ruled the kingdom absolutely, while carefully maintaining the illusion of Merovingian legitimacy, using the sacred aura of the old dynasty as a shield for his own authority. He had created a new kind of hereditary power for his own family, the de facto kingship of the mayorship. But a new system creates new problems. Pepin, like the kings before him, had his own complicated family situation, with both a legitimate wife and a mistress, who bore him powerful sons. His death would inevitably create a succession crisis for this new, unofficial throne. He had solved the question of how to rule without being king, but had he created a power structure that could survive him? And who among his heirs would be strong and ruthless enough to inherit this strange shadow kingdom, and perhaps, finally, take the last final step? Pepin of Herstal's death in 714 plunged the Frankish kingdom into a predictable crisis. He had solved the problem of how to rule, but he had not solved the problem of succession for his new, unofficial dynasty. Like the Merovingian kings before him, his complicated family life left behind a tangled inheritance. His designated heirs were his young grandsons, under the regency of his formidable wife Plectrude. But lurking in the shadows was his illegitimate, but brilliant and popular adult son, Charles. Plectrude, seeking to secure power for her own line, immediately had Charles thrown into prison. This act ignited a new civil war, but this time, it was not between kings or even mayors of different kingdoms. It was a war within the Pepinid family itself, with the Neustrian nobles seizing the opportunity to try and cast off the yoke of Austrasian domination. Out of this chaos emerged the man who would hammer the final nails into the coffin of the Merovingian dynasty. Charles, escaping from his prison, proved himself to be a military commander of genius, perhaps the greatest of his age. Over a period of several years of relentless campaigning, he systematically crushed all his rivals. He defeated the Neustrian armies, outmaneuvered his ambitious stepmother Plectrude, and brought the rebellious provinces back into line. He had forcefully re-established his family's position as the sole mayors of the palace for all the Frankish lands. He was his father's true successor, his power won not by inheritance, but by the sword. Charles, known to history as Charles Martel, was even more powerful and more independent than his father had been. He understood that the Merovingian kings were now little more than a political fiction, and he began to treat them as such. For a significant period of his rule, from 737 to 741, after the death of the puppet king Duderic IV, Charles did not even bother to appoint a successor. He left the throne vacant. The kingdom of the Franks was ruled openly and directly by the mayor of the palace, with no king at all. This was a radical step. It demonstrated to the entire world that the Merovingian monarchy was now completely superfluous. The state could function perfectly well, and indeed thrive, without one. Charles Martel's power was built on a foundation of military reform. He understood that the old Frankish system of a citizen army was no longer sufficient. He needed a permanent, professional force of heavy cavalry that was loyal only to him. To fund this expensive endeavor, he took a bold and controversial step. He seized vast tracts of land owned by the church and granted them as fiefs to his most loyal warriors. This was the beginning of the feudal system that would define the Middle Ages. In exchange for the land, these warriors became his vassals, swearing an oath to serve him in battle with their horses and armor. This gave Charles a powerful, modern army, but it also put him at odds with the church, who saw him as a despoiler of their property. It was with this new army that he faced his greatest test and won his greatest victory. In 732, a large raiding army from the Umayyad Caliphate in Spain swept north into Aquitaine, looting and burning as they went. Charles Martel gathered his Frankish forces and intercepted them near the city of Poitiers. The resulting Battle of Tours was a landmark event. Charles's disciplined, heavy infantry formed an unbreakable square, withstanding repeated charges from the famed Arab cavalry. At the end of the day, the Umayyad commander was killed, and the invading army retreated. The victory at Tours had immense symbolic importance. Charles was hailed across Europe as the champion of Christendom, the man who had stopped the advance of Islam into Western Europe. His new moniker, Martellus, the Hammer, was a testament to his military might. This victory conferred upon him and his family a new kind of prestige, one that was not based on ancient bloodlines, but on present-day deliverance. He was the savior of Gaul, the protector of the faith. And where was the Merovingian king during this existential crisis? He was secluded in his villa, invisible and irrelevant. The contrast could not have been more stark. The man with the power had saved the kingdom, while the man with the title had done nothing. Charles Martel died in 741, the undisputed ruler of the Franks, though never a king, in a sign of how completely the mayorship had replaced the monarchy. He followed the old Salic custom and divided his power, the office of mayor, between his two sons, Pepin the Short and Carloman. For a moment, it seemed that the Pepinate family might fall into the same cycle of fratricidal rivalry that had destroyed the Merovingian. But this time, history took a different course. After a few years of joint rule, Carloman, a man of genuine and deep piety, did something extraordinary. He voluntarily gave up his power, abdicated his position as mayor, and retired to a monastery in Italy to live out his days as a monk. This single, unexpected act of piety left his brother Pepin the Short as the sole mayor of all the Franks, inheriting the vast, undivided power his father had wielded. The stage was now set for the final act. Pepin was a king in every sense but the title. He commanded the armies, he made the laws, he was the most powerful man in Europe. The Merovingian king, at the time, Childeric III, was a complete phantom. A man pulled from a monastery to sit on a throne simply to keep it warm. Pepin decided to end the charade. But he was a cautious man. He remembered the fate of his ancestor Grimoald, who had been executed for his premature coup. He knew that he could not simply take the crown. He needed to have it given to him by an authority higher than himself, an authority that could overrule the ancient legitimacy of the Merovingian bloodline. He needed the Pope. In 751, Pepin the Short sent a famous embassy to Rome to put a carefully worded question to Pope Zachary. The envoys did not ask for permission to stage a coup. They simply asked a theoretical question regarding the kings of the Franks, who no longer possess any royal power. Is this state of things proper? Or, as it is more famously paraphrased, who should be king? The one who holds the title, or the one who holds the power? Pope Zachary's response was a landmark of political pragmatism. The papacy was under threat from the Lombards in Italy and desperately needed a powerful military protector. The Byzantine emperor in the east was too far away and too weak to help. The only army capable of saving Rome was the Frankish army, commanded by Pepin. The Pope's answer was therefore a foregone conclusion. He replied that it seemed better and more expedient that the man who held power in the kingdom should be called king and be king, rather than he who was falsely called king. It was the blessing Pepin had been waiting for. The highest spiritual authority in Christendom had just given him the justification to depose one dynasty and found another. The long, slow fade of the Merovingians was over. The power of the mayors, built up over a century of war, political maneuvering, and the institutional decay of the monarchy, was about to be converted into sacred, legitimate kingship. The ox cart was finally about to be retired for good. The story of the do-nothing kings serves as a quiet but profound lesson in the nature of power. It is not always seized in a dramatic moment of violence. More often, it simply drains away, slowly and silently, from one institution to another, until one day, the entire world awakens to find that the old order has become an empty, hollowed-out shell, waiting for a gentle, well-timed push to finally crumble into dust.